Well, thank you for joining us once again. Welcome to Grace. I want to get started in our lesson today. In our journey through the Bible, God's giving us a very candid look at the lives of the major players of early Bible history, those to whom He gave the preeminent positions in His plan to repossess the earthly realm and make His name great here on the earth. Might be supposed that God chose to use the men that He assumed or that He knew had inherent goodness, the inherent goodness He saw in those men. In other words, we might tend to think that God chose men who He considered to be the cream of the crop, men who He knew would conduct themselves appropriately and honorably and therefore be worthy of the positions in which He placed them. Perhaps He may even have chosen men, as we would reason it, based on their commitment to do the right thing, men who would strive to live above the sin nature that all have inherited from forefather Adam. However, we see that just the opposite was true. God chose to use common men, men like all men everywhere, who are known for their human inadequacies and sinful tendencies. That's all of us. Behavior failure, to coin an expression, I call it behavior failure, has been the common denominator of all of the Bible greats, we might call them, of our journey through God's Word thus far. Adam chose to rebel against God. It was his own choosing. Adam had volition. The nations or Gentiles that came from Adam and Eve's union did the same. They were faithless, we learn from Scripture. When we came to the patriarchs of Israel, we noted that none of those men, and we'll just put them on the Bible here in front of you, none of those men after Adam and after the nations were without sin. Abraham was a deceitful bigamist. Now, that might catch people by surprise, but when we look at his life, that's exactly the way it was. Of course, Abraham had faith, and his faith was counted unto him as righteousness. Isaac was a deceiver, as well as Abraham had been. Jacob was a lying, scheming polygamist who took advantage of his brother, deceived his father-in-law, and was more interested that he be seen in a favorable light by the Canaanites than he was in defending the honor, standing for the honor of his daughter Dinah when she was raped by those folks. But behavior failure didn't end with Jacob. Jacob's 12 sons were the fathers of the nation that God promised to make of Abram. Yet 10 of those sons engaged in a plot to kill son number 11, Joseph. And as a part of that plot, they deceived their father. So Jacob's sons were no shining examples of pristine behavior. None of these men were pictures of perfection when it came to their performance. I think we've seen that on and on again. Joseph, the one targeted by his brothers, was a talebearer, we learned early on, and a braggart who ended up married to the daughter of an Egyptian pagan priest, a priest named On, the Bible tells us. Was that significant, some people might ask, that he married a priest of Non, not named On, but of Non? Well, the city of On, rather, not known, On, was also known as Heliopolis. Now, that might strike a chord with some of you. The city of the sun, Heliopolis. It acquired that name because On was the center of the worship of the sun god Ra. Egypt artists have depicted Ra in different ways, but a common rendering of Ra has the body of a human and the head of a falcon. Resting upon the head of that falcon is the sun. The eye of the falcon, the eye of Ra, as you may have seen it depicted in artwork, was an ancient Egyptian symbol of protection and divine royal power. This was the sun god Ra. And so the eye of Ra was considered to be the all-seeing eye, always watching over and protecting the king, and always present to ward off evil. That's how they pictured the sun god Ra. You may also recall the Ziggurats of that day. We looked at pictures of some of these structures in an earlier study, but the Ziggurats of Egypt were constructed for the purpose of worshiping this sun god, little g, who I said the Egyptian called Ra, the god we've been talking about. Ra was believed to reside inside a worship center, we might call it a temple, at the top of the ziggurat. Some have linked the eye that sits at the top of the ziggurat in the worship of the sun god Ra the ancient god, the sun god, still being worshipped in some places in the world today. They've pictured that in the Great Seal of the United States, depicted on the back of every U.S. dollar bill. They've linked that Eye of Ra with that symbol. When Francis Hopkinson designed the $50 colonial note in 1778, he came up with the idea of a three-tiered structure. You see it there on the note? That's the structure on the back of every dollar bill if you look at it. And in his mind, Francis Hopkinson, that 13-tiered ziggurat type structure depicted the 13 colonies. Not long after that, the eye was added at the top of the structure, symbolizing the eye of providence, as the early men called it, of our country. The idea being that God was sanctioning the independence of the United States of America, the 13 colonies at that time. The interesting part, and who knows the reason for it, is that the 13-tiered structure designed by Francis Hopkinson is in the shape of the ziggurat. And that was the Providential Eye. The Providential Eye was placed at the top of that ziggurat structure, where Ra, in the structure of that day, resided. Why that particular design has been the subject of speculation for years and years, and no one really knows. What we do know, and this is coming from the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God who inspired the message that the apostle of the Gentiles was appointed to bring to us, is that Satan is the God, little g, of this world. He's honored that way. He's the prince of the power of the air to the people of the earth. And he is that without men even knowing that that's what's taking place today. As we don't have evolution, we have evolution taking place. What Francis Hopkinson might have designed with all good intention, no evil motivation, has turned out to be a very clear representation of Satan's intention to ascend into heaven. You see the tiered structure. The ziggurat was the same. And of the declaration of the nations to build a tower that reached into heaven. Isn't it interesting that we have that design? Paul talked about the course of this world, and he called it this present evil world. I think some would agree that in man's intent at self-elevation, self-aggrandizement, he openly manifests his ongoing degradation. It happens over and over again. Isaiah warned Israel in Isaiah chapter 5, verses 20 and 21 with these words, "Woe unto them that call evil good, and good evil, that put darkness for light, and light for darkness, that put bitter for sweet, and sweet for bitter. Woe unto them that are wise in their own eyes and prudent in their own sight." Would you agree that Isaiah's description of what was happening in Israel during his day pretty well fits with what's taking place in our day? I believe so. Is evil being called good, and good being called evil today? Hopefully most of us know the answer to that. Well, what was happening in Isaiah's day was also occurring back in Joseph's day. In Joseph's day, one of the 12 sons of Jacob, the Egyptians were worshiping that sun god, as we said, the sun god they honored, sun god Ra. They were not worshiping the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They were worshiping and serving the creation rather than the Creator. They were worshiping the Son that the Most High God spoke into existence. As we return to the study of Joseph, we find that he'd been sold by the merchants who bought him from his scheming brothers to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh. You might recall that story. We began looking into that in our previous study. Now, Pharaoh was a title. It wasn't the person's name. It was a title for the king of Egypt. What God would Potiphar, the king of Egypt, have been acknowledging? And Pharaoh, Potiphar worked for the king, but the king himself, what God would those two fellows have been honoring? Most likely, both Potiphar and Pharaoh would have been honoring the sun god, in that the sun god was the major god honored by the Egyptians at that time. And now, in our Genesis study, Joseph, one of the 12 sons, is working for Potiphar. He's been sold by his brothers. They threw him into the pit. They were going to kill him. Then they decided to sell him to the merchantmen, who in turn took Joseph to Egypt and sold him to Potiphar, a captain of the guard, right-hand man, we could say, to the king of Egypt, Pharaoh. Joseph was made the overseer of all of Potiphar's household affairs. That's how much he was admired. Things were really going well for Jacob's 11th son, Joseph, until Potiphar's wife decided to become more intricately involved in Joseph's life, intricately involved with the man her husband admired. It was Potiphar's wife, as you recall, who kept trying to seduce Joseph into a clandestine affair. And when Joseph resisted her advances, she accused him of attempted rape, after which her husband, Potiphar, had Joseph thrown into prison, thrown into a dungeon, the Bible says. Potiphar had the capacity to have Joseph thrown into a dungeon because, as I said, Potiphar was the captain of the Egyptian guard at that time. Now, as we watch Joseph's story unfold, we've already seen the 10 brothers before, how they plotted Joseph's murder. And then that was changed to come short of murder, eliminate Joseph. But now we're looking at Joseph. We're looking at the 11th son. And we find that while Joseph was in that dungeon, prospering there, we might add, because God was working on Joseph's behalf, the keeper of that prison placed all of the other prisoners in Joseph's charge. That's how well Joseph was admired. The Egyptian Pharaoh at that time had 2 different dreams. No one could interpret those dreams for the kings. We're just making a longer story shorter here, save for Joseph, who revealed to Pharaoh their meaning. Here's the interpretation that God gave to Joseph to give to Pharaoh in Genesis chapter 41, verses 29 through 32. We'll take a quick look. Behold, there come 7 years of great plenty throughout all the land of Egypt. Now Joseph was sold with all ill intention by his brothers to the merchantmen who sold him to Egypt. He's prospering in Egypt, by the way, and now he's interpreting the Pharaoh's dream. They've taken him out of prison, brought him before Pharaoh, and he's interpreting Pharaoh's dream. Behold, there come 7 years of great plenty throughout all the land of Egypt. And there shall arise after those 7 years of famine. And all the plenty shall be forgotten in the land of Egypt, and the famine shall consume the land. Verse 31 continues, and the plenty shall not be known in the land by reason of that famine following. For that famine shall be very grievous. And for that dream was doubled unto Pharaoh twice. It is because the thing is established by God, and God will shortly bring it to pass. So Pharaoh could expect great famine throughout the land of Egypt. In fact, the scripture says that famine was over all the face of the earth. And that famine was the very thing that brought Joseph's brothers to Egypt in search for food that hoped they might purchase from Egypt. And the ensuing reunion of those brothers with Joseph and Joseph's desire to see Benjamin was what brought their father Isaac and their youngest brother Benjamin into Egypt, where the entire family was well kept. That's how popular Joseph had become with the Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. He was the only one that could interpret the king's dream. All the other men of Egypt couldn't do it. The seers, as they were called, seers who worshipped the god of Ra. But Joseph knew what that dream was about. God had revealed it to Joseph. He revealed it to Pharaoh. And now Pharaoh's treating Joseph like he's royalty. He was second in command to the king himself. In fact, his chariot was placed second behind the Pharaoh, behind the king's chariot. That's how well honored he was. The people were to give obedience to Joseph, as we said. So Pharaoh made Joseph ruler over all the land of Egypt. In fact, Pharaoh was so pleased with Joseph, and here's the lineage, if you can see that on the board there. Son number 11, you see Joseph down toward the right-hand side, just in front of the last son, Benjamin. Pharaoh was so pleased with this 11th son of Jacob, if you're looking at that Jacob lineage chart, that he gave Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar. Who was Potiphar? Potiphar was the high priest of On. So here Pharaoh gave Asenath to Joseph, one of the 12 sons of Jacob, to be the wife of the daughter, who was the daughter of the high priest of On. So Joseph had 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. Ephraim, I guess is how it appears, who became 2 tribes in Israel. Nothing at all is said about Joseph refusing to take Asenath as his wife. We don't see or read that Joseph resisted in any form or fashion having a wife outside the family of Abraham, and a daughter of a pagan priest, no less. Neither do we read that Joseph sought God's deliverance from a marriage Joseph must have known would be an improper union. So we see there that Joseph was no shining example of performance perfection either. None of these men that God chose to use in his plan to repossess the earthly realm were above reproach. All of them came short of the right thing to do. Through failure after failure, God has shown us the incapacity of fleshly-minded humanity. None of these men measured up to the righteousness belonging to the God in whom they believed. Yet all of these men are major God-favored players on the stage of the Genesis account. Why? Not based on their performance at all. Not based at all on their behavior, but based upon their belief. Now, as we've said time and time again, the men God chose to use were not chosen on the basis of their behavior. Have that stamped in your minds, because this is what we're seeing in all the stories throughout Genesis here. These men were chosen based upon what God foreknew would be their belief. God foreknew that they would come to believe in him. It's never been about the inherent goodness, nor has it been about the capacity of any man, even in the dispensation of grace. It's always been about God's capacity and his faithfulness to exercise that capacity on behalf of sinful men he knew would come to take him at his word. And here it is, as he's carried out his plan to repossess the earthly realm, giving a land to a nation, the nation Israel. At the heart of God's plan to repossess the earthly realm, where Satan had usurped God's glory, saying he would rise into the heavens and be just like the Most High God. At the heart of that plan would be a nation and a land, the nation God promised to make of Abram, the nation that would come through the descendants of the man named Jacob, whose name God changed to Israel. And the land that God gave to that nation, the territory on the earth, is called Eden. Now notice this statement as we come to Genesis chapter 47, verse 27. Let's look at these people as they're in Egypt. And Israel dwelt in the land of Egypt, in the country of Goshen, and they had possessions therein, and grew and multiplied exceedingly. Do you see how God used the events in Joseph's life, as well as the land that rightfully belonged to the Most High God, and therefore that God had the right to give to the offspring of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, in order to sustain the nation that he promised to make of Abram? God is actually using the ones who would become enemies of Israel, bitter enemies of Israel, to sustain Israel. He's using the land itself in that to be their substance. Keep in mind, the land of Goshen, from whence came that oft-used expression of years past, my grandmother used it all the time, lands of Goshen, she'd say, was part of the territory called Eden. Eden consisted of the territory from the great river in Egypt, the Nile, all the way to the Tigris and Euphrates rivers to the eastern side of Eden. God planned to garden eastward in Eden, but the territory where they were, much of that land of Goshen, was within Eden. So that territory was included in the land that God promised Abram. It's amazing to see how, in spite of all those contraryites, as we've called them, in that land, God used the people who had already settled there, as well as the land itself, to benefit the people of the nation he promised to make of Abram. The people of Egypt were bringing their cattle, they were bringing their gold, they were bringing their personal possessions. They were even giving their homes and their land into the hand of the man Israel. The man of Israel named Joseph, I should say, not to Israel, but to the man of Israel named Joseph. Little did they know what God had in store for his nation, but they were gradually finding out the status that Joseph had with his God. God was continually working on Joseph's behalf. And not because of Joseph's behavior again, but because of God's foreknowledge of Joseph's belief. Israel would not only be sustained by that which the land produced. The Egyptian king, the Pharaoh of the land, was assisting in Israel's sustenance. See how God can flip things around? Of course, all that would come to an end, as we'll be seeing as we continue our journey through the Bible. Now, we haven't gone through the entire story of Joseph, because you can read about that on your own. What we have given you is the highlights of the story in order to show you what God was doing with the forefathers of the nation Israel and their failure over and over again. In spite of their behavioral failures, God exercised his name on behalf of the forefathers of his nation, and he did so graciously. Note that none of them deserved it by way of their performance, as the story of each of their lives reveals as we go through those stories. Pharaoh was bending over backwards in his efforts to please Joseph and to please Joseph's extended family. Just as Laban had benefited earlier on by the presence of Jacob, Joseph's father, the Pharaoh of Egypt was now benefiting by the presence of Jacob's son Joseph in Egypt. The Israelites found themselves on the receiving end of the best that Egypt had to offer, as God was working behind the scenes on behalf of his people. Joseph's father, Jacob, lived with his sons in Egypt for 17 years, after which he died at the age of 147. Now think about that, 147 years old. What a difference from those whose lifespans averaged 900 years plus prior to the time of the flood of Moses. Before his death, Jacob requested of Joseph that he be carried out of Egypt at his death, buried in the cave of Machpelah, where Abraham and Sarah, where Isaac and Rebekah, and where Jacob's wife Leah had been buried earlier on. Joseph did as his father requested. He carried his father out of the land. And that brings us to verse 20 in the final chapter of Genesis, chapter 50, where Joseph made this statement to his brothers, who were wondering if Joseph would show them the same kindness, given what they had done to him earlier, after their father's death, after Jacob was gone. Here's Joseph's well-known reply in verses 21-22. Now therefore fear ye not. I will nourish you, Joseph promised them. He had the ability. And your little ones. And he comforted them and spake kindly unto them. And Joseph dwelt in Egypt, he and his father's house. And Joseph lived 110 years. Now, as we come to the conclusion of the book of Genesis, we see these closing words in the final three verses, verses 24 through 26. And Joseph said unto his brethren, I die, and God will surely visit you, and bring you out of this land unto the land which he sware to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. And Joseph took an oath of the children of Israel, saying, God will surely visit you, and ye shall carry up my bones from thence. So Joseph died, being 110 years old. He was 37 years younger than his father at the time of Jacob's death. And they embalmed Joseph, and they put his coffin, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. Now, before we move into the book of Exodus, I want to take a little closer look at the son of Jacob, through whom the promised seed would come. Some people think it was Joseph or Benjamin. Wasn't either of those two boys. The seed of the woman that God promised would ultimately bruise Satan's head came through Judah, one of the sons. So let's look at the Jacob lineage diagram once again. That promised seed wouldn't come through the line of Joseph, nor would the royal seed come through the line of Benjamin. Jesus Christ would be called the Lion of the tribe of Judah. So he came from son number 4. The seed line God determined would pass through son number 4. Judah was the 4th son of Jacob and Leah. Now this might lead some to think that Judah must have been the most honorable, upright son born to Jacob. Judah must have been a cut above the rest, right? Well, some people might think that, but what have we discovered thus far in our studies? Well, we've discovered, and don't lose sight of these things, Abraham practiced deception and bigamy. Isaac was also a deceiver, as we've seen, like his father. Jacob took advantage of his brother. He was a master at deception. Throughout his life, he lied to his father. He deceived his father-in-law, who was no less a deceiver, after which he lied to his brother again, Esau. 10 of Jacob's sons plotted murder. They also deceived their father. Joseph, the 11th son, willingly received the daughter of an Egyptian high priest, of the sun god Ra, to be his wife. He also willingly returned to Egypt rather than seeking his leave of Pharaoh after the end of the famine. Joseph lived the remainder of his life in Egypt. God didn't choose any of these men based on their performance. Rather, he had the stories of their lives recorded in his word as evidence throughout eternity future that he chose men not on the basis of their behavior, but on the basis of what he foreknew would become their belief. God knew that all of these men would come to take him at his word to them. God foresaw that they would become men of faith. And because of that and that alone, God exercised his capacity on behalf of those who failed miserably over and over again, as we've seen, when it came to their behavior. God exercised his name on their behalf graciously as he was carrying out his plan to repossess the earthly realm. Now, how about Judah? After all, King David, King Solomon come through Judah's line. What about Judah? What's more, we know that Jesus Christ, Israel's promised Messiah, would come through the line of this fourth son of Jacob. Was Judah any different when it came to character and conduct than the other forefathers of Israel? We would think that Judah would be, because the royal seed line came through this man. Now, there's some extremely interesting things about Judah that I want you to consider as we're about to enter the book of Exodus. For more of the story of Judah, we're going to go back in the book of Genesis to chapter 38. Purposely left him out to bring him up at the last here. Then we'll be prepared to move into Exodus. Keep in mind something about Judah that we all know by this time. Judah had been a part as one of the sons. Judah had taken part in the plan of his brothers to deceive their father by leading Jacob to believe that his favorite son Joseph had been killed by wild beasts. Judah had been a part of that plan. Do you remember when they dipped Joseph's coat in the blood of a slain sheep in order to fool their father into believing that Joseph was dead? Well, Judah was there when that took place. Judah was involved in that plot. So Judah, like Abraham, like Isaac, like Jacob, practiced deception. There isn't any way around it. Judah's deception came in his participation in the plot to teach Joseph a lesson. But this was not just about a lesson his brothers wanted Joseph to learn. This was about eliminating Joseph from their lives altogether. This was about getting rid of their brother, their braggart brother, but in a way that would come short of murder. Judah had a role in that, folks. His hands were far from clean. Judah was not a shining example when it came to performance. After his father had been greatly grieved to learn that what he thought had been Joseph's death, notice what Judah did next to get his mind off of his guilt, I would presume. Judah got away from his brothers. He left the scene. The only problem was Judah couldn't get away from himself. Did this son of Jacob flee to Haran to take a wife from the family of his fathers? No, he chose an entirely different route. Let's retrace Judah's steps, because an extremely interesting story lies before us here. Let's pick up Judah's trail in chapter 38 with verse 1. And it came to pass at that time that Judah went down from his brethren and turned into a certain Adullamite, whose name was Hira. This was Judah's friend, a man named Hira. Now Judah headed for the house of his friend, but someone else was there that caught Judah's eye. Verse 2, and Judah saw there a daughter of a certain, next word, Canaanite, whose name was Shua, and he took her and went in unto her. Now this daughter of Shua, this Canaanite lady, became Judah's wife. How do we know that Judah took her to be his wife? Well, because she's called Judah's wife a little later on down in verse 12. Now, while her name is not given, and we really don't know very much about this woman, we are told that Judah's wife bore to Judah 3 sons. They were Er, Onan, and Shelah. Would the line of the royal seed pass through one of these sons of Judah? Because it did go through Judah's line. The answer is no, and for very good reason. You see, there's much more to the story that's just beginning to unfold. Verse 6 fills in a bit more of the detail. And Judah took a wife for Er, his firstborn, whose name was Tamar. So now Judah's deciding on a wife for Er, the firstborn son, and he decides it's going to be Tamar. Now stay with me here. Again, would the royal seed line come through Judah's son Er? After all, he was Judah's firstborn son. Again, the answer is no. Why not? Well, we're going to be given a little bit more of the detail, but verse 7 adds more to the story. And Er, Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord slew him. Wicked in what way, we might ask? Well, we're not told. And we only know that Tamar was now free to be taken as the wife of another husband, because her husband Er was no longer alive. The custom in that day, and this is interesting, keep in mind the law had not been handed down yet, But a very well-honored custom in that day was that when a husband died, being childless, his unmarried brother could take the wife of that deceased brother to be his own wife, which would serve more than one purpose. Actually, well, first it would resolve the issue of the welfare of the widowed sister-in-law. Put simply, she wouldn't be left out in the cold. She'd have someone to care for her. She would have all the rights and privileges in a marriage relationship provided in that day. However, provision for the widowed sister-in-law was only part of the picture when it came to this type of a marriage. Secondly, by becoming the wife of the brother of her deceased husband, the sister-in-law would continue to enjoy her membership in the family structure. She didn't lose her family position. In other words, she wouldn't have to marry outside the family if she married again. She would remain within the family in which she had first married. But that wasn't all. Thirdly, and this is the most important reason, through this replacement marriage, if we might just give it a name, the dead brother's heritage, offspring-wise, and thus the dead brother's name, would be preserved, because all of the rights of the brother who died passed down to the firstborn son of this brother-sister-in-law marriage arrangement. Let me show you what the law of Moses would later say about what came to be called Levirate marriage, Jibum in Israel, from the Latin Levirate, from the Latin lever, meaning husband's brother. Here it is in Deuteronomy chapter 25, beginning with verse 5. If brethren dwell together and one of them die and have no child, the wife of the dead shall not marry without unto a stranger. Her husband's brother shall go in unto her and take her to him to wife, and perform the duty of the husband's brother unto him. Do you see how God was protecting the purity of the nation and of the people, the nation he would make of Abram? Verse 6, and it shall be that the firstborn which she beareth to the brother of the deceased shall succeed in the name of his brother which is dead, that his, the dead brother's name, be not put out of Israel. By the way, the custom of taking the wife of a deceased brother as one's own wife, as I said, looks like Yibbum, Y-I-B-B-U-M, but it's pronounced Jibbum in Judaism, and it's become a very rare practice among the Jewish people of our day. There are some societies outside of Judaism, that societies where a close clan structure is in place, where the practice of Jibbum is still in operation. But let's get back to Judah for a moment. Now, this could be resisted, by the way. If the brother decided he didn't want to take that wife, he had the right to do so. He had the right to deny taking his deceased brother's wife as his own. The wife had a right to refuse. But it was a very dishonorable thing in Israel in that day to refuse to take your deceased brother's wife. Now, how about Judah? Well, we've seen Tamar's husband is dead. So Tamar was free. Er is no longer alive. Tamar is now free to become the wife of another husband. According to the custom in place in Judah's day, Er's brother, unmarried brother, childless brother, was obligated to take Tamar as his wife. Where are you, Onan? It's time to step up to the plate. So what did Judah do? Well, Judah followed the custom of his people in that day. Verse 8 continues the story. And Judah said to Onan, go in unto thy brother's wife and marry her, and raise up seed to thy brother. Now, if you've read the story, you know that Onan had no problem at all with the physical intimacy part of that new relationship. Probably welcomed it. He did indeed take his sister-in-law, Tamar, to be his wife. However, Onan had a huge problem when it came to raising up seed to his brother. So Onan purposely managed to avoid that outcome when it came to physical intimacy with Tamar. You can read about that story on your own. It's all there in Genesis chapter 38. Verse 10 tells us God's response to Onan's behavior. Here it is. And the thing which he, Onan, did displeased the Lord, wherefore the Lord slew him also. Wow. Now Tamar had become a widow for the second time. Her second husband was now dead. So what was she free to do? Well, she was free to become another man's wife once again. Both husbands were dead. You see how God was working through the circumstances of these people's lives in the choices they themselves made, having volition, to protect the purity of the line through which the royal seed would come. Judah had married the daughter of a Canaanite man. So all three of these sons would be from the offspring of a Israelite and a Canaanite. God would not allow the offspring of Judah and his Canaanite wife to be the line through which the royal seed would come. God had known all along about Er and Onan and Shelah. Judah's marriage to a Canaanite woman had certainly not caught an all-knowing God who spoke the universe into existence by surprise. So we can expect that God would allow, I should ask that as a question, can we expect that God would allow the line of the royal seed to come through Jacob's third son, or I should say Judah's third son, Shelah? And once again, the answer is no. Not going to come through Shelah either. On to verse 11. Then said Judah to Tamar his daughter-in-law, Remain a widow at thy father's house, till Shelah my son be grown. For he said, Lest, peradventure, perhaps, he die also, as his brethren did. And Tamar went and dwelt in her father's house. Now, we can expect that Judah knew something about the custom in that day about marrying within the family and the importance of it, although he hadn't done it. God had made a covenant with Abraham concerning the land. Circumcision had been the sign of that covenant. It was very important for the Israelites who wanted to remain faithful to the covenant God made with forefather Abraham that they take their wives from among those who were also a part of that covenant community, we might say. This is why Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob married within the covenant family. This is why Abram told Isaac not to take a wife from among the Canaanites. And this is why Isaac gave Jacob that same direction when it came to Jacob taking a wife. And this is also why it was important that a woman whose father was in covenant relationship with God, circumcision-wise, remain under the covenant umbrella of her father until the time for her to be joined to another covenant participant. The father wouldn't give his daughter away unless he was giving her away to someone within that family covenant relationship. Could we be learning something here about Tamar? Now, as we continue with Judah and Tamar's history, I believe things may begin to clear up a bit. Judah told Tamar to remain a widow at her father's house until his third son, Shelah, was old enough to take her as his wife. Keep in mind, Judah had married the daughter of a Canaanite man. So Judah's Canaanite wife, she's going to die as time goes on here, but even so, the royal seed line would not pass through any of the sons of that relationship. However, we see nothing of the sort when it came to the wife Judah chose for heir, this lady named Tamar, and then passed along to his son Onan. The Bible account only reveals that Judah took a wife for his firstborn son. It does not say from where that wife came, nor does it mention anywhere at all, anything at all, about her heritage. Why has it been automatically assumed, in my opinion at least, by many Bible commentators, the ones that I've run across, that Tamar was a Canaanite Gentile? Nothing along those lines is mentioned anywhere in connection with the Tamar account. Again, it just states that Judah took a wife for his son Er. So let's dig a little deeper, see if we can come up with some clues here about her heritage. The Tamar story is very interesting. Let's see if we can find some clues as to her background. Had Judah given Tamar to his third son, Shelah, the line of the royal seed would still have gone through a son of the union of Judah and his Canaanite wife. Was this not what Judah's forefathers had worked to prevent? Might that have been the real reason Judah didn't want to pass Tamar along to Shelah? Instead, he told her to remain at her father's house, and that in time Shelah would take her as his wife. I don't think Judah ever had an intention of making that happen. Was remaining under the covenant umbrella of the father not an important thing to do when an Israelite woman was waiting for her husband to come and take his wife? We know that. This was what espoused women did in the Jewish culture of that day. When the marriage vows were agreed upon by the fathers or by the representatives of the fathers of that married couple or to-be-married couple, the man being represented automatically became the husband on the spot when the vows were agreed upon, and the woman became the wife. But the wife was to remain at the house of her father, thus remaining under the umbrella of her father's covenant relationship with God until her husband came to take his wife. Do you not suppose that Judah knew full well that the marriage custom of that day? Judah chose to marry a Canaanite woman. Perhaps his emotions dictated his direction. We're not told, but nevertheless, he married the daughter of a Canaanite man. So his wife came from outside what we might call the covenant family. We're not told why he didn't do as Abraham, Isaac, or Jacob had done and take the daughter of a covenant-related man. We're only told that he married the daughter of a man who was a Canaanite. What is clear is that the line of the royal seed did not come through Er, the firstborn son of Judah's marriage, nor did it come through Onan, his second son. And it's just as clearly seen that by this point in time, Judah had no real intention of passing Tamar on to Shelah, in spite of his earlier promise to his daughter-in-law. Judah didn't want to lose his only remaining son. But the story doesn't end there. It gets more interesting as we keep reading and as we keep digging for a few more clues as to Tamar's heritage. Had Judah picked a Canaanite woman for heir, was Tamar really a Canaanite daughter? There's some interesting things that jump out at us in the story. Judah promised Tamar that Shelah would become her husband, but she was to remain, as we said, at the house of her father until Shelah reached the age where Judah was willing to make that marital transfer a reality. I think it can be safely assumed that Judah knew the custom for espoused Israeli women. He told her to remain at the house of her father until it was time for Shelah to come and take her. The question is, did Tamar also know that custom? She did exactly as Judah directed. Verse 11 says, and Tamar went and dwelt in her father's house. So let's keep reading. Verse 12 continues the story. And in the process of time, the daughter of Shua, Judah's wife, died. And Judah was comforted and wept upon his sheep, and went up unto his sheep shearers in Timnath, he and his friend Hira the Adullamite. So he goes right back to his good buddy here, Hira. You not find it interesting that Judah's Canaanite wife is never even named in Scripture? Do you suppose that had she been from Abrahamic lineage, her name would have been recorded? That's just a thought. There was certainly a reason that God had known about all along why none of Judah's sons, with his marriage to a Canaanite woman, Judah's marriage to a Canaanite woman, would carry the line of the promised seed. Rather than keep his promise, though, Judah never gave Shelah to Tamar to be her husband. Judah had lied to his daughter-in-law. And by this time, as we said, Tamar had realized that Judah had no real intention of keeping his word. Watch what happened here as we continue with verse 13. And it was told Tamar, saying, behold, thy father-in-law goeth up to shear his sheep. She knew the path her father-in-law was going to take to shear his sheep. She knew the route of his journey there. Now watch what Tamar did in verse 14. And Tamar put her widow's garments off of her, covered her with a veil, and wrapped herself, and sat in an open place, which is by the way to Timnath. For she saw that Shelah was grown, and she was not given Shelah. She was not given unto Shelah to wife. She waited a long time. Judah hadn't kept his word. So Tamar had a plan, and her plan worked. Verse 15, when Judah saw her, he thought her to be an harlot because she had covered her face. Was Tamar really a harlot? The answer is no, at least not up until this time. But Judah, as the verse states, thought she was a harlot. That's how the verse is written. Keep reading. Follow me carefully as I read verse 16. And Judah, being the godly man that he was, handed her a tract and invited her to his assembly the next seventh-day Sabbath. Does it say that? It doesn't say that at all. And Judah passed by Tamar as quickly as he could, knowing that a son of Israel and a forefather of the nation God promised to make of Abraham should flee fornication as fast as his feet could carry him. Doesn't say that, does it? How about this? And Judah, the man who would carry the line of the promised seed, because God knew Judah's heart, and he knew Judah to be more righteous than Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob combined. Not a chance. Not if what God's been showing us all along about the men he chose to use continues to hold true. What God has been showing us throughout the book of Genesis is the men that he chose to use were not chosen according to their behavior. They were chosen according to what God foreknew they would come to believe. Let's get back to the correct version. And Judah turned unto her by the way and said, go to, I pray thee, let me come in unto thee, for he knew not that she was his daughter-in-law. Judah, the man through whom God chose to carry the line of the promised seed, was soliciting what he thought at the time was a prostitute. And Tamar, his daughter-in-law, said, what wilt thou give me, that thou mayest come in unto me? Now, Tamar was playing the part. And she was playing it very well, but think about this for a moment. Tamar had to know something about the character of her father-in-law to have even come up with such a plan in the first place and to think that it would work. And work it did. And Judah's beginning, he's ready here to offer her a price. Verse 17, and Judah said, I will send thee a kid, a young goat from the flock. And she said, wilt thou give me a pledge till thou send it? What do you have to leave as earnest, Judah? There sits more evidence that Tamar knew about Judah's character before she ever put her plan into motion. And Judah said, what pledge shall I give thee? And she said, thy signet, and thy bracelets, and thy staff that is in thy hand. And he gave it to her, and came in unto her, and she conceived by him. 9 months later, folks, Tamar gave birth to Judah's twin sons, Pharets and Zerah. King David came from the line of Pharets, and naturally David's son Solomon. And from the line of that same son of Judah and Tamar, Pharets, came the royal seed, and the bearer of the sins of the world, the Son of God, Jesus Christ. Did God choose Judah to be the line through whom Israel's Messiah and the Savior of all men would come, according to the Apostle Paul, because of the inherent goodness that God saw in Judah? We know differently, do we not? We've come this far with the story of Judah. Let's take it just a bit further in our remaining moments here to see if Judah knew that he was doing wrong by contracting with one who he believed to be a prostitute. Was there any guilt there? Or was that just a common, normally accepted thing in that day? Well, let's look. When it became obvious that Tamar was pregnant, Judah's daughter-in-law, word was sent to Judah that his daughter-in-law had played the harlot. The problem was no one knew the man responsible for Tamar's pregnancy. Verse 24. And it came to pass about 3 months after that it was told Judah, saying, Tamar, thy daughter-in-law, hath played the harlot. And also, behold, she's with child by whoredom. And Judah said, bring her forth and let her be burnt. Oh, so Judah knew. Judah knew what he had done was not the right thing to do. But he didn't know that his daughter-in-law was the prostitute that he had contracted. So now he's told that his daughter-in-law played the harlot, and now let her be burnt. When she was brought forth, she sent to her father-in-law, saying, by the man whose these are, am I with child? And she said, discern, I pray thee, whose are these, the signet and the bracelets and the staff. Wow, just as Nathan had done with David, just as Paul did with the saints in Colossae. Here we have Tamar turning on her heels, so to speak, probably not high heels, and saying, thou art the man. Judah was caught in his tracks. Verse 26, and Judah acknowledged them and said, she hath been more righteous than I, because that I gave her not to Shelah my son, and he knew her again no more. Why did we take the time? Now, here, his reason for her being more righteous is that he didn't give her to Shelah as he had promised, didn't keep his word. But earlier he said, let her be burnt for playing the harlot, and he had been responsible for contracting her. Why did we take the time to go through story after story in the book of Genesis about the lives and activities of the patriarchs and the forefathers of the nation God promised to make of Abram back in Genesis 12? We spent this time to illustrate what God wants us to see as we read the history of these men's lives. It's never been about the goodness of man. It's always been about the capacity resident in God's name and about his gracious bestowal of that capacity upon those he knew would come to take him at his word. It's never been about behavior. It's always been about belief. There's no better time to pull up a passage, a couple passages actually from Paul, than right now, as we've had a very good look at Israel's forefathers. You remember this verse, I'm sure. It's Romans chapter 4, verse 5. I would hope that everyone within earshot of this message would have this passage well memorized. You'll recognize it immediately. Romans 4:5. But to him that worketh not, the context here is worketh for a righteous standing before God. For him that worketh not for that righteous standing before God, but believeth on him that justifieth the, next word, ungodly, that person's faith is counted for righteousness. So it's been about faith all along. The forefathers of the nation Israel are proof positive that Ephesians chapter 2, verses 8 and 9, were just as true about the people of time past as they are true for us today. You know this verse as well, Ephesians 2:8-9. For by grace are ye saved through faith, and that salvation, is the idea there, is not of yourselves. Salvation is the gift of God, not of works, lest any man should boast. So, if it was of works, a man would boast. So does the word works there mean sins, or does it mean works of righteousness that a man's trying to do? It's works of righteousness. No man is saved by his works of righteousness. And so, not of works, lest any man should boast. Here it is again. Abraham was guilty of deception and bigamy. Isaac was a deceiver like his father. Jacob was not only a deceiver, he was a liar and a polygamist. Jacob's sons plotted the murder of their brother and deceived their father. Joseph was a talebearer and a braggart. Through the line of Judah came Jesus Christ, even though Judah plotted against his brother. Married outside the family of the Abrahamic covenant, lied to his daughter-in-law, and was a fornicator. The good news, in spite of all the bad news that we've just seen, is that none of these men were used of God because of their performance. They were God's men, because God foreknew they would be men of belief. These are the major players here, some of them anyway, of Bible history. These are the forefathers of the nation God promised to make of Abram. Now, as we leave the book of Genesis and enter the book of Exodus, do you suppose things are about to change? Things are going to get better here. Are men going to become better and better as time goes by? Or will God continue to teach the lesson about man's incapacity on the one hand, while he holds up the capacity of his name on the other? And will we continue to see that issue of the land keep cropping up as God continues to work out his plan to repossess the earthly realm through a nation that he promised to make of Abram? By this point in our journey through the Bible, you should have the pretty good idea of what to expect as we work our way forward. Having gone from Adam through Judah in the book of Genesis, there's another major player of Bible history that's about to enter the scene. The man named, who can tell me? Moses. The man named Moses. He's next to come across the stage. The man God chose to lead the children of Israel out of what had become their Egyptian captivity. What about the man named Moses? Would you suppose that Moses was a picture of performance perfection? Did God choose Moses on the basis of his behavior? Let's move into Exodus chapter 1, and we'll set the stage for the man named Moses. At the reuniting of Joseph with his father and his brothers, and with Pharaoh's blessing, Israel was a family 70 strong when they were given the land of Goshen, we talked about a few moments ago, as a dwelling place in Egypt. But as we enter the second book of the Bible, the book of Exodus, we find that things have changed in a very big way. Notice Exodus chapter 1, verse 7. And the children of Israel were fruitful, increased abundantly, and multiplied and waxed exceedingly mighty, and the land was filled with them. Wow, these folks are multiplying like the proverbial flies that we often hear about. There were Israelites everywhere. Right up front, we see, though, that issue of the land once again. The land was filled with them. And this is really going to be about Israel's right to that land by way of God's gift decree of the territory of Eden to Israel. Verses 8 and 9 of Exodus as we move forward. Now there rose up a new king over Egypt, which knew not Joseph. And he said unto the people, Behold, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. New king is getting worried. Come on, let us deal wisely with them. Chapter 10. Lest they multiply. Oh, he doesn't want them growing any more than they are. He wants to actually decrease their numbers. And it can't come to pass that when there falleth out any war, they join also to our enemies and fight against us. And so get them up out of the land. This new king over Egypt appointed taskmasters over the Israelites to afflict those folks. He didn't want them multiplying. He wanted them decreasing. How is that working for Pharaoh? Well, how was it working for the Egyptians? Let's take a look at verse 12. But the more they afflicted the Israelites, the more they multiplied. The Israelites multiplied and grew. Satan was working his plan. Remember, we called it Operation Elimination. Operation Extermination, Elimination. Actually get rid of Israel. And God was working his own plan. He was actually using Pharaoh for a time and the land itself to sustain his people Israel. And now, Pharaoh, this new Pharaoh, is saying, let's get these people out of the land altogether. And they were grieved because of the children of Israel. And the Egyptians made the children of Israel to serve with rigor. This began their captivity in Egypt. Before, they weren't captives. Now they're captives. Exodus 1:14. And they made their lives bitter with hard bondage in mortar and in brick and in all manner of service in the field. All their service wherein the Egyptians made the Israelites serve was with rigor. Oh, they're taskmasters, all right. They're pulling out the whip. They're going to make these people serve. Israel had moved from being the invitees under one Pharaoh to becoming the captives under the next. And this takes us right up to the time of Moses and the story of Israel's deliverance. But how did Pharaoh, this new Pharaoh, want to rid Egypt of Israel? Well, his first step was through the midwives, through the Hebrew midwives, if you recall that story. He spoke to the midwives of the Hebrew women, and he said, when they're upon the stool, giving birth, was the custom in that day for birthing a baby, kill the boys. Just kill the boys. Did the Hebrew midwives follow through with Pharaoh's plan? No, they refused. They had compassion for these babies. They refused to do it. And so when Pharaoh said, why did you not kill these baby boys as you were instructed? Their answer was, and probably truthfully, these Hebrew women are strong women. They deliver faster than we can grab those boys and kill them before they're delivered. In fact, he wanted them to abort the babies and then tell the Hebrew mothers that their babies were born dead. But in fact, the midwives refused to follow Pharaoh's plan. And so what happened? The babies were born. And now Pharaoh's going to go to step 2. If the murder of one baby at a time does not work, what's he going to do next? He's going to try wholesale genocide. That was his next plot. In the next passage, and we'll see this as we come back to this study in our next time together, in the next passage, he tells all the people of Israel to throw the baby boys, born to the Hebrew women, into the river. Throw those baby boys into the river? Yes. Kill them. He was intent on keeping Israel's numbers from increasing, and through their hard work, they would actually begin to decrease till Israel was out of the land altogether. Now there was a Levite, that was another of the 12 sons, a Levite man who took a Levite woman to be his wife. And guess what they had? A bouncing baby boy. Well, she hid him. She hid him for 3 months until the time when she assumed she just could not hide him out any longer. And so what did she do? She built a ark, actually a box. She took a box. She daubed it with slime and with pitch so it wouldn't leak. She put her bouncing baby boy in the box, and she laid him among the reeds beside the river. That's how desperate they were. She had to hide him out, and this was the best way she thought she could do it. And who should happen upon that bouncing baby boy in the ark hidden in the reeds by the river? Pharaoh's daughter. Pharaoh's daughter. Isn't it amazing how God works? Pharaoh's daughter found the baby. He was crying. She had compassion on him, the Bible says. So she has to find somebody to nurse this baby boy. So look how God arranged things. How does she feed this baby boy who definitely needs to nurse? She has a Hebrew woman hired to nurse the baby that she's going to raise as her own. Guess who the Hebrew woman was she hired to nurse the baby boy? His mother. What was the name of that baby boy hidden in the reeds, among the reeds, along the side of the river? His name was Moses. And now we come to the entrance of this great man of the Bible, the man named Moses, as he comes on the scene. And this will become Israel's freedom, her deliverance from her Egyptian captivity, as we'll see in our next study. So stay with us, stay tuned. This is an amazing journey through the Bible. We're just giving you the highlights. We're definitely not covering all the details. I would recommend that if you have an opportunity, you read through these stories, these books. Just take one book and go through. You don't have to go through all the genealogies, but go through Genesis sometime. And then read through Exodus. It'd be an excellent time to read through Exodus right now while we're entering this book. So some of these things will be established in your minds as we go. And you're going to see as the time continues here that our study, our journey through the Bible is going to really pick up steam. We spent a lot of time in Genesis because we wanted to lay a proper foundation. But now it's time for Exodus, and we'll be begin to move a little more rapidly. Let's thank God for what He set before us in His Word, that we might use the doctrine that no man has ever been justified by works. It's always been by faith.